Ella, thank you for joining me. Tell me, who is Ella McCrystal?
So I am a psychotherapist. I own a health clinic, multidisciplinary. Most of my work is sort of focused on trauma and really importantly, mind-body system. So although people come to me for the psychotherapy aspect, because of the clinic, but also because of my knowledge of the mind-body system, that's really where I focus, because nothing that happens up here doesn't, happen in the body. It's really linked. So really important to state that from the beginning, that that's kind of where I work.
Yeah, all of that's fascinating to me. It's fascinating to anyone watching or listening.
Yeah.
How did you get into that?
Okay, so the long story short is my history is of childhood sexual abuse. It was my dad that sexually abused me over a period of years. He went to prison and my mum actually stayed married to him, and then when he came out of prison, we're going back 30 years now, well actually more than 30 years, when he came out of prison, my mum brought him back into the house. So by the time I was 16 I left home, which 30 years ago it wasn't easy. I kind of stayed in really squats and bed sits and was at rock bottom for a really long time, had some proper mental health issues around that time as well, so self-harm. I call them suicide attempts, but they weren't really, they were cries for help.
Cries for help. You must have felt so isolated and alone. Having followed you and read up about you, knowing we're going to talk today, I'm a dad of two daughters, two teenage daughters, that I just want them to be safe, I want them to be happy. So for me, that is just the most awful thing to imagine, let alone knowing it's actually happened to you.
Yeah.
And then secondly, knowing that if ever there is anything that happened to me as a youngster or happens to the girls, they come to their family, they come to their mum and their dad.
Yeah.
So not only did you have the abuse from your dad, but then I guess you couldn't even talk to your mum. So you must have felt so alone.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that she said to me when I was taken home by the police, because it came out at school, I told someone at school, and like gossip, it just spread really quickly. And then obviously teachers were involved, police were involved, got taken home. And the first thing my mum said was, I'm not sure if I'm going to stay married to your dad or not. And I just remember thinking then, like, this is not going away, this is going to get worse. To the point where I had to go and visit him in prison. She just, I think in her head, and maybe she tells herself this, she thought she was keeping the family together, but she had no idea of the level of fear, because there was violence as well. It wasn't just sexual abuse. And it was, you kind of just knew that it was never going to end. And you would hope that children, when they tell something awful like that is happening, that there's a relief. Well, it wasn't for me, because I knew that it wasn't going to end. I knew he would come back. And interestingly enough, 30 years ago, or beyond, he was allowed to come back. Now I'm not sure how easy that would be, but back then it was just kind of, you were left to it. There was no services, hence the reason I got into psychotherapy.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Yeah. Did you have anyone you could reach out to and talk to? And I'm talking friends and extended family. I don't know if you've got any brothers and sisters, and then friends that found out about this and were like, actually, are you okay? Do you need someone to talk to? Because did you bottle this all up to then ultimately turn it into a positive? Because you are helping people now. Yeah. It must be a driver for you.
Definitely.
Because at long periods of your life, you had no one to help you.
No, I didn't. Unfortunately, I think people thought they were helping, but everybody sort of supported my mum and dad. And again, I think looking back, maybe they did it because if they helped them, they could keep an eye on me. But the problem is that when everyone supports them, you don't have a safe space. I don't think teachers knew what to do with me. And I saw a social worker twice. And then I remember, because I was self-harming, cutting at the time. Again, a way of expressing rather than attention. It's called attention seeking, but really it's an expression of internal pain. And nobody listened unless I did something really extreme. That was the problem. So I learned that the extreme behaviours got me seen. And obviously, if you're abused in any way, shape or form, or bullied, being seen is where you feel safe. So those maladaptive behaviours were really a form of communication.
Of course.
I had to go and have some stitches taken out at the doctor's surgery. And the nurse was lovely, and she sort of looked at me with kind eyes and gave me all of that. But the doctor, who was also my dad's GP, came over to me, leant over while I was on the bed, on the doctor's couch, and said, "Stop wasting our time." They were his exact words. And so from that point on, I just never reached out again.
How old are you at this point?
15.
That's such an impressionable age.
Yeah.
Hormones raging,
Yeah.
teenage girl. Where do you go from there? Because the bit that scares me, makes me quite emotional actually, is many people could go down a rabbit hole of spiral of depression and disappear
Yeah.
and do the unthinkable.
Yeah.
Whereas you're sitting here now radiant, positive, and again, helping people. And you've obviously got yourself qualified to professionally know how to help people.
Yeah.
I want to know the journey from self-harming, from being totally alone as a 15-year-old plus to being the other now.
Well, unfortunately, when you're sexually abused, the difficulty is that you don't have boundaries. So you end up being quite a lot of dangerous situations. So 13, I was raped by a 20-year-old man.
How old, sorry?
20. He was a friend's brother, and I was at their house, and I guess I didn't have very good danger signals because I wasn't really a normal teenager. I was a bit wild. I was drinking early, escapism, all those sorts of things, and trying to find a place to belong. So I kind of ignored red flags, and I didn't know what they were, to be honest, because I'd lived in a house that was dangerous. And then at 17, I was raped again in walking home with a friend of a friend who was a man. I thought he was going to call us a taxi. He went to a phone box and called another friend, and I was raped on the way home. So, funnily enough, and I don't make light of this in any way, shape, or form, but it was at that point that I just thought, if I don't change something, I'm going to die. I'm either going to kill myself or someone else is going to kill me. And I started to look around me, and this is the curiosity in me. I started to look around me, and I was seeing friends that are around about my age or a few years old. Remember, I'm living on my own at this point. And I started to think, well, they're earning money and they seem to have like good relationships with their boyfriends or their friends. I just need to learn to do what they're doing, because again, I didn't have a blueprint for this. So I kind of started to study people. And it was at that point that I started to work at the Northampton General Hospital and be around nurses and doctors. And I was just intrigued by people, like, how are people doing this? So I started to really pay attention. And it was the curiosity that saved me. Because I think had the second rape not happened, I don't know if I would have been, it's rock bottom, essentially. I don't know if I would have been as desperate to work it out. And I think I had to go there because essentially there was nothing else. It was rock bottom and curiosity that saved me. And unfortunately, you can't advise that to people, but that is often what happens. And if you look at entrepreneurs in general, they tend to be the people that have experienced some dark, dark times, and they've got this push, this desire. And so if you are a curious person, you've got to start looking at where you want to go, not where you've been. And that's half the problem. Everyone looks back. And we need to do that bit in psychotherapy. But a lot of the work I do is EMDR, which is trauma-focused, brain-based stuff, clinical hypnotherapy, but also quite a lot of high-end coaching stuff within the psychotherapy as well, like leadership coaching, high-performance coaching. And if you combine all of these methods, I think you can get a really good tailored response for each person to find the way forward, rewrite the story. Because with neuroplasticity, we know that we can rewire the brain. So we have to rewrite the timeline, we have to rewrite the story, we have to change the perspectives. And it's not easy to do that just by talking, hence the reason I use hypnotherapy, EMDR, because they get into the brain in a different way.
And that curious side to you, which I think curiosity is so powerful, right? If you're not asking questions of yourself or other people, you're not entwined into life.
Absolutely.
Curiosity is the heart of this. I can't wait to talk to you. I'm learning now. I'm quite overwhelmed from what you just said about all of that then. And actually it's led me to think, not just because you're giving so much of yourself, but you've got clients that come to you for all sorts of different mental health issues or wanting help. Is there a common thing that people are coming to you about, particularly talking in December 24, with social media causing all sorts of doom scrolling and judgment and so on? Is there anything that you're kind of starting to piece together with your natural curiosity? Gosh, this is actually sort of 70% of what people are coming to me about, and that's what I need to focus on.
I would say that most people don't really understand what trauma is. So they present with something. It could be anxiety, or it could be, something along those lines. And I know as soon as I see that email come through that it's going to be deeper, because trauma can take so many different forms. It could be being bullied at school. Most people have experienced that. Some people have experienced that more than others. But also, we see now a lot of children that were in a blended family and they were in two places. You know, they never had that stability of one home. Or again, abuse, neglect. And I think also what we see is, if you look at the field of epigenetics, which is our gene expression changing through the years, you only have to go back 2 or 3 generations where our grandparents or our great-grandparents were in the war, and then the knock-on effect of how they would have brought up their children, our parents or our grandparents, and the sort of maladaptive learning that our grandparents and parents picked up, and that's continued. So often there is a bit of neglect and there is a bit of trauma. And, you know, even if they're not experiencing it firsthand, they've seen the trauma in their parents. So I guess the thing that links it all together is some form of trauma. And I think we need to change our thinking around what that looks like, because most people think of it as acute. They think of it as something like a car accident or cancer. And of course, those things are extremely traumatic. But actually, it's much more in depth than that.
Because that's an impact, that's high impact.
Yes.
But actually trauma can build up over time.
Definitely.
Right?
It's
It might be, yes.
It's so layered. And I think people are hurt. And there's so many people now, particularly since, 2020, where they are, I would say, a lot more people talking about suicidal thoughts than ever before. And I've done this for 20 years. So this is a time where suicidal ideations are becoming more and more spoken of. I don't know if it's because people are more comfortable to talk about it now, or whether people are actually feeling it more. Financial things for men in particular over the last few years, that is one of the biggest problems with male suicide. So I see a lot of men that are struggling with, how do I be a man now? I'm not earning the same money as my wife, or I lost my job in 2020 and I've never been able to pick it up again. And because maybe there's some insidious trauma from before, they're stuck in this limited mindset. So a lot of trauma and a lot of kind of 2020, again, I hate to say it, but a lot of suicidal ideations and thoughts I'm seeing more of now.
It scares me with the whole, particularly the stats in men.
Yeah.
And one of the things I hear you talking about a lot is vulnerability.
Yes.
You talk about it as yourself. You talk about it in sort of relation to clients and potential clients. I feel like that's a trend that is going in the right direction.
Yeah.
I'm having more vulnerable conversations with men, whether it's here or in my personal life. Are you feeling that?
For sure. I think particularly with men, and I encourage men more so, because I think women have been able to have vulnerable conversations for a bit longer. Go back 30 years, maybe even 40. The men were out at work. Generally, women were at home in their community of other women with the children, supporting each other. And I think those vulnerable conversations were happening around the kitchen table.
Yes.
I think men are, struggling specifically now to know where the line is between vulnerability and masculinity. And I think it's a hard thing to find in yourself if you've got an image of what a man should be. So, I think vulnerability in the male conversation is really important, just to sort of work out what that is for you. But one thing I'll say is it's very difficult because it leads to uncertainty. What will people think about me if I tell them this, or if I'm authentic? But if you're not telling them how you feel, if you're not being vulnerable, they don't get to meet you anyway. So who are you presenting? What mask are you wearing? And that's a lot of the problem, is that people are not being themselves. They're being a version of themselves that other people, or they perceive other people want them to be. And I say, look, if you come forward with your true self, your true opinions, not everyone's going to like it, but at least the people that love you for who you actually are. And
they can help. You can help in a professional capacity. If it's someone that reaches out to you as a friend, or to me as a friend, and they mask, or they are not vulnerable and they don't say what they're really thinking, I can't help them.
Of course.
And I don't know if you agree with this, I'm sure you'll agree with this. I find real strength in a man when they're vulnerable.
Me too.
And it inspires me to want to do more of that. Now, you professionally can talk to people like that, as well as being the lovely Ella, but in friendship groups and so on. But what would you say to someone that's listening to this, male or female, and thinking, I still don't feel comfortable? Ella might make me think I could go and talk to her, but I'm still not going to pick up the phone or send an email, but I want to. I know that would help me, but I'm not brave enough to do it. I'm not feeling vulnerable enough. What advice would you give to someone that's thinking that?
I think the first thing is that look for somebody that's being vulnerable themselves. You know, I have had some criticism over the years for being too open about my story, because one of the sort of training 20 years ago was be the blank canvas. Don't say too much about yourself because it's not about you, it's about them. However, I think part of the problem with that is that if you go to a therapist and they say, so tell me about yourself, and they're just sort of going, there's this sense of, are we connecting? So I try to be as authentic as I can. And I talk quite a lot in the first session, so they don't have to. The first 2 sessions with me is a lot about education. So what is your brain doing? What is your body doing? Why are they doing that? What are the things that you've experienced? So you might say to me, I've got anxiety. And I'd say, okay, with that in mind, here are some different types of anxiety. Here's why you might have it. And here's what your brain and body are doing as a result. And I'll say things to them because I can pick it up quite quickly after doing it for so long. They don't realise how much they're giving off to me. Could be their body language, their tone of voice, just tiny little things that they say. And they say, how do you know that about me? So if you go to someone that's willing to do the education piece first, and if you go to someone that's willing to say, look, I can promise you, I've been diagnosed with almost every mental health disorder in the book. I get it, you're going to feel judged by a lot of people, but I am never going to judge you because I've been there, done that, worn that t-shirt. It's about finding that person, because the relationship with your therapist is everything.
Definitely, and this is really interesting because it brings AI into it.
Yeah.
So I could go into ChatGPT now as John Reynolds and ask a question and then get very accurate information that I could get from you.
Yeah.
But there's no empathy.
Yeah.
And if I use that word, there's so much empathetic, emotional intelligence from you. And by giving information, you're being vulnerable.
Yeah.
I would be comfortable, not just saying, I would be so comfortable talking to you and giving information because you're allowing me to. And the one thing I could never say to you is, well, how would you know? What would you know? So actually that advice you were given 20 years ago does sound so archaic. You've obviously been through this, because again, and then you can mirror that to what you put out on your socials.
Yeah.
You know, you have a massive community of engaged people on socials, and you put positive content out that could be talking about stuff that's really traumatic and stressful, but you're doing it to inspire, to give information that actually draws me in to actually think, well, if she's doing it, I can do that. So you're leading by example, you're being inspirational.
And I think the important thing was, you know, Instagram for me was always a place for reaching people that would never reach out. So that, you know, I've had so many people that have ended up following me saying, I've been following you for a couple of years, but I wasn't ready to follow yet. That's the point of the Instagram for me, is that you can just watch from afar. You don't have to commit to anything. You don't have to tell anyone. No one sees that you're following me. It's there. And that doesn't bother me. You know, luckily for me, I've been able to build a really positive community. And I say luckily because I feel so proud of that community and those people in it that, you know, are so brave and they share so much with me. And then some of them become clients, but obviously there's quite a few followers, so I couldn't take them all on. It would be impossible. But what's really beautiful about it is they are, for the first time, telling someone, me or other people that they follow, about what's going on for them.
That creates a habit, right?
Yes.
That creates curiosity.
Yeah.
And that might mean they don't necessarily come to you as a client, but they might start opening up doors and questions to help themselves in whatever it is that they're locked in with, right?
So important that you have someone or somewhere. And I do try and answer all the DMs. I can't always because, and I also sort of, you know, I have to be careful with that because you could get yourself into a loop that you can't get out of with someone that's really, you know, dependent. So I'm always good at signposting and safeguarding and making sure that if they can't see me, I've got a team of people as well that they could potentially see.
It's almost like there's a responsibility there, isn't it? And
of course.
Maybe not a welcome one because you can't be everywhere.
Yeah.
But you are potentially being reached out to in people's, well, you are being reached out to in people's crisis moment.
Yeah.
Some people might come to you saying, because you deal with phobias and stuff, which if you're scared of spiders, it's not going to kill you.
Yeah.
But it could be a massive issue for them. It could be a phobia of heights and it's stopping them getting a job or what have you. That could really play on anxiety.
But that's all trauma.
Yeah.
You know, phobias, everything, if you look at anything, you look at ADHD, autism, phobias. I mean, I have OCD. It's not a massive problem now, but it was after I had my daughter 17 years ago. It just came from that hormonal impact. But I think the trauma kind of superseded that. And I mean, I've been diagnosed with ADHD now as well. Like I said, I've had all the diagnoses. But ultimately, if your brain has to adapt to some kind of trauma, be it epigenetically or in your own lifetime, because the nature-nurture thing, you can't really separate it. It's like the brain-body system. It's all one. you will end up with an adapted brain. So the brain adapts to all the trauma, and you end up with maybe problems with executive function, which is why we see so much ADHD now. And people say, well, wasn't it always there? And I'll say, well, of course, because there's always been trauma in life. And, you know, the ancestral traumas or the genetic traumas go back generations upon generations upon generations. So we see that the adaptation in the evolving brain means there's more, I think, ADHD, autism, complex PTSD, and all of the mental health issues stem back to trauma. So I think the reason I keep saying that is whatever you're dealing with, be it a phobia, be it anything, even if it's not your trauma directly, your brain will have adapted. And that's why so much of what I do is brain-based. And not only am I trying to give people information that they can relate to, in the work I'm actually trying to do more than just give you a safe space. And therapists like me doing a similar sort of work, we're actually trying to reprocess, reprogram, so that you can have a balanced brain-body system, and you deserve it. We all do.
Absolutely, everyone does, right?
Yeah.
And actually, just going back to 15-year-old Ella onwards to the patients that you see, you know, you look fit physically, and you are clearly mentally fit. Now, a lot of your mental fitness comes from the fact that you're probably constantly evolving your growth. You're learning all the time. You're seeking knowledge.
Yeah.
You're even learning from patients' conversations.
All the time.
So that stimulates you, that can come from a day-to-day point of view. The reference to physical fitness is, you know, that ultimately is connected to being mentally fit.
Of course.
What do you do, and what have you done to prioritise both the sort of physical fitness and anything mental fitness outside of professional knowledge?
One of the first things I realised, I suppose, when I was curious at 15, was the people that were doing really well, they did have like really good habits, and they had really good boundaries, and they would do things like, I mean, I was heavily overweight actually. I was 8 stone heavier than I am now. So
when was this?
This was, I lost all of that weight when I was 21.
So would that have been all part of the whole self-harming?
Covering it all up.
Yeah, fine.
Yeah, it was trying to protect myself.
And when you lost that weight, was that because you mentioned that hitting the bottom and then almost bouncing too much? So all of that was part of just building. It was part of it.
I mean, I started to walk everywhere. So that was my first sort of room into fitness. It was walking everywhere, and I started to eat differently, think differently, because I was being curious. And so as I started
building good habits.
Yeah. And I've never stopped them, because I feel so good now. I mean, life was pretty awful, and it was scary, and I was kind of, I don't want to say I was to blame for some of the things that happened, but I certainly didn't know how to help myself. So when I could be curious and just watch people and observe, because I think observing is so important. I always tell people to observe themselves too. I started to journal, which I know is really cliche, but I really feel that that's such a positive way of seeing yourself. Very quickly on that, a lot of people don't want to write down things because either they can't be bothered, quite frankly, or maybe they don't want people to see it.
Could end up in the wrong hands.
Could end up in the wrong. So you can get voice apps now. So voice recorder is one I use. It's $1.99 a month if you want to transcribe it as well. You can literally talk into your voice recorder and talk to yourself.
Is that like self-therapy as well? Because
Absolutely.
Journaling ultimately, and I've done it, and I got into a bad habit of not doing it recently.
Yeah.
But you are outpouring.
Yeah.
You're compartmentalizing.
You're talking to someone. One of the things I'll tell you, and it's funny because I laugh about it now, but when I was a child and I had no one to talk to, I talked to myself in the mirror, and it was I needed to speak. Was
that positive self-talk as well?
I think so. Well, sometimes I was.
Were you trying to? It was almost like I'll be okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to be. I'll survive. I'll get out of this. Or was there anything like what's happening to me? Was it a bit of both?
All of that.
Okay.
So I would.
But ultimately, you were expressing.
Yeah, and then I was being the other person. So I was being the wise mind, which is what I teach people to do now. Go into wise mind observer mode. So I was doing that naturally. And now, for people that say I'm not journaling, I hate it, I say to them, use your voice recorder, speak to it as though it's a friend. Get the transcription, and you mentioned ChatGPT, really good little trick. Get your transcription or notes if you've written it on your phone, put it into ChatGPT and say, based on this excerpt from my journal, please give me 3 really powerful goals for this week. And your journal then becomes your therapy because ChatGPT is clever enough to do that. That's not therapy, it doesn't replace it, but it gives you somewhere to start. So if you're going to journal, be it voice journaling or not, and you can actually voice journal into your notes. So you can transcribe it. You don't even need a voice app, actually. You can speak into your notes and then copy paste and put it into ChatGPT. I tell my clients to do that because I can really only see people once a month or bi-weekly because I'm so busy. So I say in between, do that. And then tell me what the goals are, and I'll kind of make it a bit more tailored for you. So just send it to me and I'll send it back. And I think that's such a good tip. If you can't afford therapy or you don't want to speak to someone, start there. And
you can do stuff
people
in between, and actually that means you don't have to see Ella every week.
Yeah.
But you're building up enough information for you to be very, very smart and clever in a relatively quick amount of time, which saves them money.
And I always give them a little program in between anyway, like a little mini program, because I like people to have that accountability mirror. It's really important.
One of the things that I was thinking about before we were going to sit together was trust issues, because we've built trust equity together through getting to know each other to film today. You chose that this would be a safe space for you to have a conversation. Yeah. Your clients choose to do that when they get to know you, and then there's a moment where there's trust. At points in your life, trust was blown to pieces. Going back to the whole, at least even if I didn't get on with my parents, I could trust them. Siblings and so on. Yours was decimated, mother and father. Yeah. So that then brings into play that 15-year-old Ella going into 17, 18, the rapes, boyfriends, let alone them becoming a mum. And I want to know where you sort of almost built that trust and forgiveness, and forgiveness of people, the human beings that have massively abused you, to be someone that sitting here now feels incredibly humble and fulfilled and actually happy, which is lovely, by the way, knowing what you've been through. Yeah. Has that taken a lot of effort? And is that now effortless to you? Or do you still have voices in your head where, like you said, at certain times in your life, you weren't able to necessarily read the red flags? Yeah. Whereas now you're like, is that still work in progress? Because for me, without in any way, no one's perfect, but you feel very rounded. You know what I mean? The whole lived experience along with the professional side seems to come together in a really good marriage there. Would you agree with that? Yeah,
I think trust is a really fabulous question. Because I often say to people, what do you think trust is? Because we all talk about, I can't, if someone's cheated on you or whatever, they say, I just can't trust anyone ever again. And I say,
trust is being myself with someone. I can say something to you and you're not going to judge me. You're not going to criticize me. You might give me some advice, but I can trust you, and you're not going to share it with other people if I ask you not to. That's trust to me.
It is, yeah. And how do you build that? The people that you're with have to be authentic, and you have to be authentic. So when I say to someone, look, it's really interesting that you feel like you can't trust anyone again, the number one thing you need to do is look at yourself. Can you trust yourself?
So it starts with you.
It starts with you. And that leads me back to that question about, I didn't have anyone I could trust. So my main route into that was understanding. And really importantly, when my dad sexually abused me and he was, physically abusive and all of that, and there was a lot of fear around that, the really important thing to say here is I never felt like it was my fault, but I did feel responsible for his feelings. So I felt sorry for him, and I felt, I'm not saying he did this on purpose, but the way the abuse happened, it wasn't done in an aggressive way. And a lot of people that have been sexually abused by a parent will tell you this. Actually, when the actual sexual abuse is happening, that's the least violent that they are. And it's when they're, he used to belt me and he would play games, narcissistic games in my head and stuff like that. The sexual abuse was awful and horrendous, and I'm not trying to take away from that. But actually, it was at those points where I thought, I feel really responsible for your feelings because something's not right here. That led me into really trying to understand him. And then when my mum stayed with my dad, the only way to survive it, because I knew that he was coming home, was to understand her and her motives. And so for me, I guess the way I've worked out trust is if I'm going to do that for other people, I have to understand myself. And so when I was making mistakes and I was being really wild and at times narcissistic, manipulative, I wasn't always a pleasant person to be around. I was extremely angry, full of rage, which little girls are not allowed to be, by the way. We're allowed to express emotion as long as it's not angry or rageful. As soon as you do that, you're a bad person. So you hear that again and again.
I wonder this because your childhood must have been marred with feeling like a bad kid and misunderstood.
Oh, yeah.
You're not like to tell everyone. I mean, obviously, a lot of what happened to you became public in school and so on. But a lot of people will still not allow you to get away with that. Whereas actually, in today's world, I'd like to think you'd have been wrapped up and actually a lot more forgiving.
I think it would be seen now as well, it'd be spotted.
On forgiveness, have you forgiven your father?
I have, and it's so controversial because people always say, well, you know, I don't think we should forgive these people that abuse children. But my answer to that is, if we don't have a forgiveness, the little boy, Tommy, down the road, who's currently being sexually abused by someone, what are we going to do about him? Because he's going to turn into someone like my dad. My dad had been sexually assaulted in a park.
I wondered that. So that led to... Right, okay.
And he was, you know, back then, I mean, my dad's 76. He was born in Paisley, Renfrewshire, Paisley, and he had to identify the man that did it to him. It's a one-off occasion, but I think for a boy that was around 10 or 12 at the time, never being able to talk about it, he's got to identify face to face, swept under the carpet. What happens to someone of that age? It's when his testosterone's forming, his sense of power. What happens is...
It's a violation, right?
Yeah.
He's been completely violated.
And the victim becomes the predator. The abused often becomes the abuser if they're left to it. So a lot of this paedophilia that we see, there's two different types. Some that are just attracted to children and some that actually act on that. The problem is with this is that people won't talk about the bit where they're attracted to children because they fear that they're going to be judged. They fear that they're going to be put in prison for thinking those thoughts. So again, if a boy is being abused now and we don't have that ability to forgive, be curious and understand paedophilia and child abusers, which is so controversial. I know a lot of people are going to be angry that I say this. If we don't rehabilitate, if we don't forgive, if we don't understand, we'll never learn how to properly rehabilitate the boys and the girls that are sexually abused now.
It's weird, because what you're saying makes sense. I'm struggling to agree with it.
Yeah, I know most people do.
My dad have daughters, and for me, the whole evolution of the way that human beings go through sexual maturity to then almost be ready, it's a massive violation to go before that.
Yeah.
And there is, just personally, there's nothing attractive about a young kid.
No, to you.
Because they're not ready. Yes, I get it. So when I'm listening to you and I'm taking this in a professional context, like super respectful of your knowledge with lived experience, you've got to listen to that. It's like, wow, it's humbling for me. Because as you can probably tell, that heightens something. I mean, I'm not an aggressive person, but when you hear of sexual abuse in children, it does make me angry.
It's like awful.
Because those, and this is the thing, it goes back to you, they're defenseless. You know, I am the protector of my family, if that makes sense. You know, if anything happened to my children, my daughters, and had happened when they were younger, I don't know what I'd do.
No, I must admit,
because
I'm the same. Like, if someone so much as looks at my daughter in the wrong way, and she's 17 now, so she's of an age where she can really sort of go into the world and speak her own voice and stuff, I still get that.
Yeah, I bet.
Because I'm a mum.
You've got an overarching maturity of professional, which makes you formidable, actually, in terms of, it's super interesting to talk to, because you've got the lived experience married with copious amounts of professional knowledge, and then you're relevant because you're practicing it all the time.
Yeah.
So you'll have someone talking to you tomorrow where you're just constantly elevating your perspective and forcing yourself to be immersed in the sort of the storytelling element. But yeah, I mean, like, I could talk to you for all day. I've got questions that are forming out of questions, but we're going to need to stop here. But I just thank you for being so open with me and for sharing everything about you, but also ultimately what you do and how that helps people, because it's absolutely fascinating, Ella.
Thank you for giving me the space as well, because it's an important subject, and I think we talk more about it now, but we still need to keep talking about it.
Definitely.
Especially for the people that do feel either they've never been able to talk about sexual abuse themselves, or conversely, for the people that are struggling with these thoughts, intrusive thoughts about maybe they do have those paedophilia type thoughts. This conversation has to be as open as possible. And I will say this very briefly, if there are people out there that are having those thoughts, there are therapists like me that will help you deal with those thoughts. It's not something that you should ever not talk about if you're having those kind of insidious paedophilic thoughts, because we as a community, as therapists, I think we have a duty, not everyone will agree with this, and again, I'll probably get slated for it, we have a duty to be part of fixing a problem.
No, I think you've articulated it really well. I mean, I made my point about how I feel about it, but they're not going to talk to me. They're not in my ecosystem.
Yeah.
You are professionally trained to have those conversations and help them. And dare I say, actually, if they do reach out, however they feel about it, then something can be done constructively for them and for society.
Yeah, and by the way, in a very safe way, because if I felt that someone was just doing it for titillation, I would obviously have a duty of care to report them. But if they genuinely are coming for help, then I kind of want to put it out there.
Safe space.
Yeah.
Well, I hope you found this a safe space to talk, because you've been an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you
Bella.
for having me.
Thank you.